you very much for coming along to this session today, and hello to the online audience too. I'm Morena Stanley and I work in the Training Accreditation Council Secretariat. I'm one of the managers there. There is a second slide here, but this is more for other presenters who present information around the standards and other matters of compliance. But I am representing the regulator today, so that disclaimer doesn't apply to me. So just give me a moment and I'll just call up my slideshow. All right. So you've come along today to hear a little bit more about the standards for RTOs 2015. They've been in place now just over a year. They came into play last October 2014, and this time last year I was delivering a session exactly on the standards, and I was running through some of the key new clauses and some of the standards where there was a little bit more information than previously. At that time, we were all learning. The standards were still very new. We're a year down the track now. We feel that we've had time to settle in. We've had lots of discussions with our auditor group, our auditor panel. We meet with them for 4 moderation sessions per year, and there's a lot of ongoing moderation that goes on outside of those sessions. So we're really, the consistency in our auditing and consistency in our application and interpretation of the standards is really a key focus for us. So we've all learnt a lot through this past year. Auditors are starting to see what people are doing around meeting compliance requirements around the standards, and really for us it has been a year of let's just see how this plays out. There's a lot more prescription in the standards, as you all know, so for a lot of the standards there is a lot more information, a lot more guidance. There's the definitions, there's the context statements, and all of that together, and with all of the detail, we've gone from a 3-page to a 36-odd, 33-page document that contains the standards. I think you'll all agree by now, hopefully you've had an opportunity on more than one occasion within your organisations to become more and more familiar with this document. You are able to access the standards via the TAC website, tac.wa.gov.au, and the website will be at the end of my slide. We have a tab at the top of our front page of our website, Standards for RTOs 2015, and in there you'll find a bit of an overview. You'll find our fact sheets that we've published to date. You'll find our user guide. And just on our user guide, I'll just say that we will be publishing a version 2 early in the new year, just as this year has unfolded and we've learnt more about the standards, and we've been developing up a set of fact sheets. We've been able to be a lot clearer and provide a little bit more information and guidance to RTOs and in understanding the standards. And we've included some visuals, some pictures, some diagrams that hopefully help people dissect parts of the standards which are causing the most discussion, I suppose. So today's session will focus on three of the clauses: amount of training, validation and marketing. We found throughout the year, there are other areas as well. I don't have enough time to cover off everything, but today I wanted to really focus on those 3. They're really the 3 that have, particularly amount of training and validation, have had the most discussion amongst our auditor group, amongst queries from RTOs. Marketing, I want to spend a little bit of time on today because it is a subject that comes up a lot through our complaints management processes. So RTOs or others in the marketplace will contact us and say, look, so-and-so's promoting that they're doing this when they're not scoped, and all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of issues around marketing that particularly come up through our complaints process that I wanted to highlight today as well. So starting with amount of training. So that's clause 1 and clause 1.1 and 1.2, and if you've got a copy of the standards handy or have them online, you can read them for yourself as well. But 1.1 is the RTO's training and assessment strategies and practices including the amount of training they provide, are consistent with the requirements of training packages and VET accredited courses, and enable each learner to meet the requirements for each unit of competency or module in which they are enrolled. And further to that, 1.2 goes into a little bit more around what is amount of training. So from 1.1 to 1.2, for the purposes of Clause 1.1, the RTO determines the amount of training they provide to each learner with regard to the existing skills, knowledge and experience of the learner, the mode of delivery, and where a full qualification is not being delivered, the number of units or modules being delivered as a proportion of the full qualification. So I'm going to go into those things in a little bit more detail now. So, but before we do that, if you've got a pen and paper, I'm just stealing this idea from one of my colleagues from a recent presentation. And for the online audience, if you don't have a pen or paper, or just pretend you're writing this down, I want you to write down volume of learning. Very important. Okay, now cross it out. Okay, amount of training. Clause 1.1 and 1.2 are not about volume of learning, okay? The focus is amount of training, okay? There's been a lot of discussion and other professional development around the place, and this term volume of learning comes up quite regularly. And we may have referred to that a lot in the early days of the standards, but as we've come to understand what this standard is about, we want to put volume of learning to one side, volume of learning within the AQF to one side. It's relevant, but the focus of this clause is around the amount of training. The amount of training that's appropriate for the learner or for the learner cohort that you're engaged with. So the RTO is required to have training and assessment strategies that provide an adequate amount of training for learners. Amount of training is the amount of time it takes a learner to learn everything required by the training package or accredited course for that training product. Is the Bible. You know, obviously you've got to meet compliance requirements against the standards. But the other thing that we're measuring compliance against is that you're meeting the requirements of the training package and that your learners are being trained and assessed against the requirements of the training product itself. In determining an appropriate amount of learning, as per the clause, you've got to consider learners' existing skills, knowledge and experience and the mode of delivery. And this is going to impact on the amount of training, whether it's a shorter amount of training or a longer amount of training, depending on the individual or the cohort that you're dealing with. Now, we have attempted to pull this together into this picture here, which helps provide some context for amount of training. We haven't quite, we're days away from publishing a fact sheet on amount of training, and this picture will be in the fact sheet, so look out for that. Again, under that tab, Standards for RTOs on our website, you'll find in the drop-down menu, fact sheets. So if you go there, I think you'll find currently there are about 4. In the coming days, there'll be a whole host more, 7 or 8 added to that list, which is terrific. And early in the new year, we'll have subsequently a few more fact sheets as well. So we're rolling them out pretty quickly now. So look out for this one, amount of training. And as I said, the fact sheet will have this slide in there. So. But of course the slideshow will be available for everybody after this session. So we've attempted to pull amount of training into this visual, and you can see the amount of training is the blue across the top, and that's the focus. So that's the biggest box, and that's particularly the focus. We don't want to ignore volume of learning, course duration and nominal duration, because at the end of the day we need to acknowledge that those things, those terms, that terminology are terms that we refer to within our sector, whether you're accessing public funds, you've got your nominal hours guide. Sorry, I think the title has changed. You've got the volume of learning that's linked to the AQF for a full qualification, and that's a description of the volume of learning applicable for a full qualification. And so I just wanted to, and I'll go into the parts that are in blue and a little bit more in the coming slides, but this slide just is an attempt to really summarise the focus of amount of training and how those other things fit in around the amount of training and the other considerations that we understand are there, except when you're sitting in an audit situation with our auditors, they're going to be looking for evidence around amount of training only. Okay, some of those other things may have contributed to and sit there as other influences, but they, for the purpose of the standards, those things just sit to the side. Okay, so it's really important that you're aware of that. So what are we looking to see? The determination of amount of training includes all its components. So when I refer back to the previous slide, all of those components include class attendance, assessments, structured workplace experience. You know, these are examples, projects, assignments, pre-reading, follow-up activities, all those things that contribute to the learning. Okay, and in some cases the assessment, but I'll talk about assessment a little bit more in a couple of slides' time. Okay, but it's all of those things that contribute to the learning, okay, time in learning. Yet at the same time considering where that learner's come from. Do they have prior knowledge, prior experience? Are they an RPL candidate? Are they a school student undertaking a vet in schools program? Do they have no experience? Then they're your standard learner who may take 6, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years to undertake a program, different to your RPL candidate. And really the auditors will be looking for different strategies for those different learner cohorts. There's no mathematical formula for amount of training. So the auditors aren't going to ask you for the numbers, for the number crunching around amount of training. It's really your job, as many of you have probably sat in our auditors, the auditors will say to you, look, tell me your story, tell me who's your learner cohort, how have you arrived at the amount of training for this student cohort or this particular individual, how have you made adjustments for somebody with some kind of difficulty or learning difficulty or disability that's going to impact on their amount of training. So the auditor is going to be looking for how your strategies, how your training assessment strategies, including your amount of training, have been adjusted depending on your different groups. So at the end of the day, it's a reasoned and thoughtful account of what extent of engagement is expected of a learner, okay? If you stick to that, you're going to be on the right track. It's nothing more than that. As I said, the auditors will be looking for evidence in the delivery and assessment strategy documents, okay, and unit delivery and assessment plans, or whatever it is that you call those things. As I said, the auditor will be asking you the questions, they'll be looking for evidence, they'll be asking for evidence. So it's your job to be able to justify and explain the amount of training that you plan to deliver and how you evaluate how that amount of training is adequate or appropriate to your learner, okay? Both during and after delivery. So there isn't a process of evaluation and revision for your amount of training, just as there should be for any of your training and assessment strategies. That afterwards, you look back, it's a process of continuous improvement. I said I'd just touch on assessment, and we've had this question a lot. Is assessment included in the amount of training? It is when it's considered, when assessment and learning is integrated, okay? It's really difficult sometimes to separate assessment in VET, okay, in competency-based training and assessment, as you all know. Many of you have a lot more experience than me in this space, so I'm not telling you anything that you already don't know. And where these structured activities are considered as part of the assessment making process. So assignments, projects, work that people are required to do outside of a structured, face-to-face environment. And there are many, many other examples. I'm sure you could rattle off 20 or so in 10 seconds. Structured time solely for the purpose of assessment shouldn't be considered as part of amount of training. So that example where maybe they have to come in for a 2-hour test assessment of some sort, where there's clearly no learning, it's purely an assessment environment, then that's not to be included. So overall, our auditors will say, and we only had this conversation with our auditors last Friday actually, there needs to be a balance. If you're presenting something to our auditors where there's more assessment than learning, then there's going to be questions, and the auditors will want to drill down a little bit further than that, and maybe the balance is wrong. So usually you'd see more learning time than assessment time, okay? So, but again, that depends on your cohort. But in the main, there needs to be a balance towards more learning than there is assessment. Okay, if you're including that assessment time, so just be conscious of that. And again, when we publish our fact sheet, you'll see this visual in there as well. Another way that we've attempted to provide providers with a little bit more assistance and guidance around these particular clauses. So where you're considering a shorter amount of training is where somebody has existing skills and knowledge. They already work in the industry. They already have some relevant qualifications. There's a fairly intensive face-to-face component. They're full-time students, okay? I won't go through all of them, but over to the longer where there's absolutely no knowledge or skills. They've not at all worked in the industry prior, etc., etc. They're part-time students. So I think you get the idea. But this is another attempt to really try and provide some, pretty a reasonable level of assistance around this space. And I just want to also note before I move on to validation that there is a link to clauses 1.5 and 1.6 in the standards, which is about industry consultation. So in 1.1, you have the requirement that training and assessment strategies meet training package requirements, etc., etc. 1.5 and 1.6 is around the fact that your industry consultation informs your training assessment strategies, and that includes amount of training. So the auditors will look for those linkages. So there are links, and there's a lot of links across the standards, and this is one that I'm pointing out for you today in case that wasn't obvious before. So 1.5 and 1.6 link to 1.1. So what I'm saying is the evidence trail at 1.5 and 1.6 is required to demonstrate training assessment strategies are informed by industry. Okay, so just note that you're probably doing it anyway, and you're doing it consciously anyway, but just note that auditors will also be looking for that against 1.1. Assessment validation. Now, this fact sheet is already published, so for those of you online who have access to your computer, you can also be having a look at our fact sheet online under that tab that I mentioned earlier. So this one we already have published. It's quite a big fact sheet, just about 5 pages. There's a lot in there, but we feel that this has been a particularly contentious space, not contentious space, but where there's been quite a lot of discussion and query from RTOs. So we've spent a lot of time presenting a lot of information around assessment validation in that particular fact sheet. So I encourage you after today to go and have a look at it, download it, and share it amongst your staff. But the focus, even though the particular standard around assessment validation is around clauses 1.9, 1.10 and 1.11, through this presentation we'll be pulling in 1.8 as well. So as you know, assessment validation has been strengthened in the standards this time around. It was there, we've said all along that validation isn't new, it's just that it's strengthened in the new standards, and there's a lot more prescription around it, so it demystifies us to a degree the validation requirements. So clause 1.9 says that RTOs are required to develop and implement a comprehensive plan for the ongoing systematic validation of assessment that includes all training products on the RTO's scope of delivery. Okay, and the standard does say comprehensive plan. 1.10 is that the RTO is required to validate the assessment practices and judgments for each training product at least once every 5 years, with at least 50% of the products to be validated within the first 3 years of each 5-year cycle. I'll go into that a little bit more later on as well. And you must ensure that validation is conducted by one or more suitably qualified persons who are not directly involved in delivery and or assessment of the training product being developed. And I'll talk about when there's not a team and it's only one person coming up, and that's quite okay. So, assessment validation, this is the question that you need to ask yourself. So, I encourage you whenever you're getting your teams together or as individuals you're working through an assessment validation process, this is really the question. Quite simply, do the assessment practices meet the requirements of the training package, and are assessment judgments being consistently applied? That's not new. That's the question that you should always have been asking yourself as you undergo assessment validation always. So it's a really good question that there may be different ways of asking this question, but this is the one that we've come up with that I think says it simply. So do your assessment practices meet the requirements of the training packages, and are those assessment judgments being consistently applied amongst all of those assessors who are delivering the same training product? Okay, so that's key, and always, I encourage you to always keep coming back to that question. You may have that question at the first thing on the agenda for every assessment validation meeting. So the overall outcome of assessment validation is to ensure assessments are valid and meet the requirements of the training package or course or accredited course that you're delivering. The principles of fairness, flexibility, validity and reliability are met. Again, this is nothing new. The evidence used to make a decision about competence is valid, sufficient, authentic and current, and all of those things are I hope you're not referring to the old standards anymore, because they have been changed slightly in the new standards. Assessors are familiar with the outcomes being assessed. Assessors reach accurate and consistent decisions that inform assessment outcomes. Again, nothing new. And potential improvements to assessment practices are identified and acted upon. And auditors will be looking for all of those things, okay? There's been lots of discussion within our auditor group and beyond, and these are really essentially the things that they're going to be looking for. So not that they have they'll be listening for those things coming from you as an RTO about how you go about your assessment validation processes. So there are some clues. So as you're preparing your RTOs for audits, ask all of these questions of your teams. So who can participate? The validation process can be undertaken by a team or individual. Okay, now but noting, and it is in the standards, that if a team approach is used, the trainers and assessors who are directly involved in the training and delivery being validated may participate in the team. However, they can't contribute to the requirements of clause 1.1, and 1.1 is about the particular instance of training. You can't be involved in the validation process in the instance of training that you are actually involved in. That doesn't meet the requirement. And if an individual approach is used, validation must be undertaken by that person who meets the requirements of clause 1.1. I'll just go into 1.1 there. So it requires participation in the validation process by personal persons other than the trainers and assessors directly involved in the instance of training and delivery being validated. Involved in the instance of being validated that hold or currently hold. So they must have vocational competencies and current industry skills relevant to the assessment being validated. Current knowledge and skills in vocational teaching and learning, and the training and assessment qualification or assessor skill set referred to in item 1 or 3 of Schedule 1. So Schedule 1, at the back of your standards, Schedule 1 is the cert requirement to have the Cert 4 in training assessment, and 3 of Schedule 1 is the assessor skill set. Okay, so it's fine for one person, for a one-person team, but that one person must meet all of those requirements. Okay, it doesn't have to include an external person to your organisation. That's not a requirement. If you have a look under 1 point. Industry experts may be involved in validation to ensure there's a combination of expertise set out as per clause 1.1, but it's not necessarily. Keyword there is may. So there's no mandate for RTOs to bring industry experts in from outside.
The TAE, Cert 4 TAE, does it have to be external validation if you live in the Cert 4 training assessment?
It may. I'll have to take that.
I thought it was
Let me take that away.
Yeah, no, that was a must.
Yeah. Let me take that away. I'll make sure I'll write that question down and come back to everybody. Yeah. I'll come back to that one. I'll keep going. Yes? Oh, sure. Sorry. So the question was whether an industry expert was required when you're validating the Cert 4 training and assessment. Or external person is required when you're validating the Cert 4 in training and assessment. So I'll take that question away. So, when you're developing your plan. So clause 110 states that each training product is validated at least once every 5 years, with at least 50% of products validated within the first 3 years of each 5-year cycle. And the intent of this requirement is that over a 5-year period, the assessment practices and judgments of all training products on your scope must be systematically validated, including those where there's been no enrolments. Now, our auditors aren't going to, again, number crunch this. There's an expectation that, again, it's your job as an RTO to justify why you've selected the particular sample that you have. We're not providing sampling calculators and all of that sort of thing, that it really is the plan and how you determine which products, when, and all of that is really something that you need to defend in an audit situation. And the standards do point to risk. You know, there's some element of risk assessment when you're in determining which products you validate first. It may be that you've got some delivery coming up really soon and you select a particular group of units rather than the back end of units which aren't going to be delivered for another couple of years, for example. So it needs to be really common sense. Some common sense applied. And like I said, our auditors aren't going to be counting the number of training products on your scope and doing the math and expecting that so many units or training products will be validated. So just be mindful of that. But it really is something that's going to have to make sense for your organisation as well. Okay. But again, asking the question, is the assessment process actually doing what it's supposed to be doing? And again, in our fact sheet, we've attempted to break that up into 3 stages. The question needs to be answered across all stages of the assessment process, including at the design and purchasing of assessment tool stage, during the conduct of assessment, and during the review period of assessment processes. Okay? And these stages will most likely be a starting point for informing your assessment validation plan in the end. So there is an expectation that all assessment resources, whether you've purchased them or designed them internally, must be validated prior to use in accordance with the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. Okay? And we suggest that a mapping document of some kind where assessment tools are mapped to the unit would generally be considered as some evidence towards meeting the requirement of assessment validation under 1.9, okay? We're suggesting that. I mean, you might not call it a mapping document of some sort, but that at least there's some evidence where you've where you've aligned that the assessment resources that you're using do meet the units, the requirements of the unit of competence or the training products that you're delivering. During use, an RTO's assessment validation plan may include monitoring of the use of assessments by assessors who ensure they are implemented appropriately and are being used in accordance with the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. Okay? The application stage of assessment validation may also verify assessors are familiar with assessments and the outcomes they are assessing. So this is during, whilst those assessments are being conducted and those assessments are being presented to students. Evidence sampling should be ongoing through the assessment process, and this allows for assessment judgments before summative decisions are made. So just some ideas really for good practice and some things to consider to help inform your assessment validation processes, okay? So here that there really does need to be some kind of monitoring during assessments being conducted as well. And then post-use, it's really a review stage, which is self-explanatory. The review stage of the assessment validation process is a quality assurance process that evaluates if your assessors have reached accurate and consistent decisions. So it's really the full circle that have informed the nationally recognised training outcomes. The rules of evidence have been met through the collection of valid, sufficient, authentic and current evidence. Competency decisions are valid, fair and reliable, and in accordance with the principles of assessment, and assessment validation outcomes and actions are used to inform continuous improvement of assessment. So again, use some of these dot points, possibly turn them into questions. So every time you're undertaking some of these requirements that you sit with people and you ask these questions, okay, could we be doing this? What's missing? And like I said, some of these dot points may be some triggers. I'm sure a lot of you are doing this already, and I'm not telling you that something that you don't already know, but there may be 1 or 2 dot points in there which give you some ideas to help improve some of your existing processes and systems. When validating a whole qual or a skill set, the assessment practices and judgments of at least 2 units of competency must be validated. And again, that'll be in our fact sheet. Okay, so that's because the standard talks about training products on your scope. Okay, and a training product on your scope can include, for many of you, a qualification level, okay, or a skill set. So we're saying that at least 2 units of competency must be validated within that qualification. So that makes it very, very clear there's no grey area. Now, our auditors will be looking to see that you've been evidence of recording your judgments, okay, so again, giving you a tip on what our auditors will be looking for. There must be a process to maintain records of assessment validation activities. All right, so when you're talking to some of your colleagues and your staff who are undertaking some of these tasks, you need to record who's leading and participating in the assessment validation process, including their qualifications as is one of the requirements within one of the clauses, including the industry skills and vet knowledge. The sample tool itself, the assessment validation tools used, samples considered, etc., etc. So again, some tips for what you should consider in collecting evidence around your assessment validation processes. And again, this is very draft, and you'll notice that this particular picture is not in the fact sheet that we published. We're still playing around with it. We haven't quite got it right, we think, but we'll be looking to update our fact sheet for validation in the new year with the intent of including some kind of visual to help people understand, particularly when you're out and about within your own RTOs, that gives you a quick, easy reference snapshot of assessment validation. Okay, so again, that'll be in the slide. I've put draft across it. It's not published, it's not final, but it's there as a starting point, and we'll continue to work on it and improve it for publication in the future. Marketing. Marketing is, like I said, quite topical. We receive a lot of complaints through the TAC office around basically RTOs dobbing on other RTOs on their bad marketing practices actually. So there's a list of requirements under standard under clause 4.1. If you'd like to have a look, there's a good almost page dedicated to marketing on page 21 of the standards. And look, the primary audience for marketing is your prospective learner. RTOs must ensure all marketing is accessible, accurate and informative. Standard 5 also. I'll turn over here. Standard 5 also points to marketing requirements. Page 22 and 23. Which really focuses on the learner being very clear about basically what are they enrolling for? What can they can expect from you as an RTO? What's the course duration likely to be? You know, what does the course content look like? Am I going to have to come to class? Am I not? What's the workload outside of any face-to-face, if there is any? Are there any third-party arrangements in place? Am I going to have to go to another site? This is about transparency and being clear to the prospective learner about how you will be delivering that particular training product. There should be enough information to ensure that each learner makes an informed choice, okay? There's a lot of information on websites. We've actually done a bit of a desktop scan of every website for TAC registered RTOs, and there's a few common issues: logos used incorrectly, people advertising for training products that aren't on their scope, which is pretty serious non-compliance issue. So I do encourage everybody to have a bit of a scan through your websites. I know some of them are pretty large. It's hard to keep on top of everything, but keeping your website information to prospective learners up to date and accurate is really, really important. It does avoid complaints and those sorts of issues in the long term. Some compliance issues, like I said, that we're finding is RTOs are not including the training product code at all. Okay, you must, it's a requirement, you need to use the unit code and the titling as per the training package or accredited course. A common pitfall is people not distinguishing between accredited and non-accredited training. Not including the RTO code on all your marketing. And like I said, over page 21, 22 and 23 gives you a full description of what the expectation is across the clauses. If you're working in partnership with one or more of training products on your scope, you need to make it very clear to prospective learners who you're in partnership with and what those arrangements are. Even when those arrangements change, if there's a change to the agreement in some way, shape or form, or the agreement ceases, you need to let your learners know, and the auditors will be looking for evidence of that. There also is a requirement for you to let the regulator know who you have partnership arrangements with as well. So the standards do go into that, and there's in the glossary terms, also a definition for to give you some guidance around what are the types of services if you're outsourcing the partnership arrangements that we need to know about and have on our register. So if you could check that if you're an RTO that has partnerships, that the people who are supposed to let us know have let us know that you're in partnership on certain training products. Like I said before, some RTOs are advertising training products not on scope, and at times there's not enough information to learners regarding partnership agreements. It's a real complaint hotspot actually, so people need to be very clear about who they're enrolled with. Often a learner will be sitting in a class or having engaged with unbeknownst to them, a third party actually, then receive a certification, a statement of attainment or a qualification from another party, not realising that's actually who they were enrolled with, but they've only ever engaged with the third party and the learner was under the impression they were the RTO. So that happens more often than you might realise, and it is a big issue. So that's it. Keep a lookout on our website. We will be publishing many more fact sheets. Our website is there. We have a tab, as I said, standards for RTOs, and a drop down there. You'll find fact sheets, users guide, access to the standards. There's our inquiry, and many of you, if you're regulated by TAC, you'll know who your registration officer is within the office, and that's our office phone number as well. So I encourage you to contact the office. Registration staff, as you know, are very, very helpful. If we don't know the answer, we'll go away and check and come back to you pretty quickly. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the online audience, and have a great day.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth. Spoken by Morena Stanley.